So the first panel that we are going to be focusing on, or we're going to be having, is going to be focusing on immigrants, victims, rights, and visas, particularly around the U and T visas. We've got an amazing panel of experts to talk about this. And moderating this panel is Tanvi Misra, who's a staff writer at CityLab, the Atlantic's website about cities. She covers immigration, housing, economic inequality, and criminal justice from a local lens. Her writing includes exclusive reportage, deep investigative dives, narrative features, and policy analyses, as well as essays and cultural critique. She also curates CityLab's bi-weekly culture newsletter, Navigator, which elevates diverse perspectives on places, real and imagined. Through her work, she seeks to foster nuanced conversations about equity, identity, and belonging. And I believe this will be a very nuanced conversation. So take it away.
Thanks so much, Meredith. Thank you to Dan and Meredith for having this important conference and this panel. I'm really excited to introduce our panelists who are incredibly knowledgeable on these issues. I just wanted to take a brief second to also thank Sarah for her keynote address. I found it incredibly inspirational as a journalist. I've been following her work for a while now, and I feel like she does this really it's a masterclass in being able to illuminate exploitative systems and tell the stories of people in a way that is that resonates and makes you really understand the impact of some of the things that you're seeing in the world. With that, I want to go ahead and introduce our panel. We're going to be diving in a little bit into T visas and U visas and the kinds of things you're sort of seeing on the ground under this administration. And in order to do that, we have, and I'm going to start on the far end there, Suzanne Tomatore, who is the co-director of Immigrant Justice Projects at City Bar Justice Center. She has almost 20 years of experience representing survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, child abuse, and violent gender-based crimes in immigration and other civil legal matters. Amy Fleischauer, who's sitting next to her, is the Director of Survivor Support Services at the International Institute of Buffalo, and supervises a team of case managers and advocates working with survivors of human trafficking and domestic violence. She currently serves as the co-facilitator of the Western District of New York's Anti-Trafficking Task Force, a position she has held since 2007. And next to me here is Gonzalo Martinez. He's a program manager for the Buffett-McCain Institute Initiative to Combat Modern Slavery, a comprehensive program to counter human trafficking in the agriculture sector in Texas. So let me start, Suzanne, perhaps I can have you start us off giving us some historical context on U visas and T visas. Why were they created, and sort of what has been the effect of having them in place?
So, good afternoon. Could everyone hear me okay? Okay. I think back to the origin of the humanitarian visa process post-asylum, which predates all of this, would be under the Violence Against Women Act in the 1990s. In the mid-1990s, the first humanitarian immigration relief for survivors of domestic violence, specifically survivors of violence at the hands of a U.S. citizen or permanent resident spouse, allowed a process for people to apply for status that just replaces family-based immigration processing. In the fall of 2000, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed, which expanded other humanitarian immigration options to include T non-immigrant status and U non-immigrant status. T, or T visa for short, is specifically for survivors of human trafficking, and the U, this is the letter T and the letter U. T for trafficking is just coincidental. They're just at that point in the alphabet. A U is another immigration relief for survivors of mostly violent crimes. There's about, well, now almost 30 crimes in the statute that someone could be a victim of. If they cooperate with law enforcement, they may be eligible to apply for a U non-immigrant status. The cooperation requirements are a little bit different between T and U, but one of the major differences now is that there's a tremendous backlog for U non-immigrant status. So as of March of this year, which is the last time I could get some statistics, there was about 208,000 principal applications in the backlog for U non-immigrant status, and the government only allows 10,000 per year. So right now, when we apply for someone to try to obtain U status, there is a process where there's a temporary approval called interim relief, which would allow someone to know if their case is probably going to be approved and allow them to get work authorization. And right now, that takes about 4 years. So it's not an easy fix, but often it's the only path to lawful permanent residence here in the United States, because over the last 20 or 30 years, the immigration laws have become so restrictive. Most people don't have any option under family-based or employment-based immigration, or, you know, the options are just so few. It wasn't like generations ago.
So we've been talking about some of the policy changes under Trump, but I do want to sort of lay out in more detail some of the challenges that you were seeing with these visas. You mentioned the backlog, but have the panel sort of expand on some of the challenges you were seeing even before this administration took office. And yeah.
So in addition to the backlog, one of the major challenges for both the T and the U is cooperation with law enforcement. So for the U application, actually both applications, there's a form that law enforcement could certify that someone was helpful in the investigation or prosecution of the crimes that are listed under the statute. For the T, someone has to show that they attempted to cooperate. And cooperation doesn't apply in the same way if the individual is under 18 when the trafficking took place. In other words, with the T application, the certification is optional. You just have to show an attempt to cooperate unless you're under 18. There's an extreme hardship exception as well. However, for a U, there's also a form, but it's an absolute requirement that someone have it certified by law enforcement. So that's very, very challenging depending on where you live. So here in New York City, many certifiers now have policies. It took, almost 18 years or so. At the state level, there's now policies for many of the certifying agencies. At the city level, the local district attorney's offices were one of the first certifiers many years ago. NYPD has a policy on their website. The ACS, the Child Protective Agency, has a policy. But if you live upstate in a rural area or in another part of the country where law enforcement may not be as interested in signing off on these certifications, you could be a victim of the same crime and be unable to obtain certification.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Amy, what are you seeing in your work that is the same, and what are you seeing that has changed as a result of this administration?
It's a very broad question. I guess one of the things I wanted to talk about that I was really thinking a lot about during the keynote this morning is that there is, so I'm from Buffalo, and we are in a liberal state, and I live in a liberal city, in a liberal county for the most part within that state. So there has been, within certainly the Obama administration, this started and has continued, even more so now, a movement with executive directors of immigrant service agencies within several upstate communities to talk about the economic impact of immigrants, the positive economic impact of immigrants within Western and upstate New York. And they've really mobilized around a lot of these issues. So as I was listening this morning and even thinking about this, in Buffalo, everybody knows each other. We're pro-immigrant for the most part. Our county executive, our local police, our mayor really have made very public statements to talk about being pro-immigrant. And so a lot of the issues that we're talking about, while of course, the fears are there. Our numbers have not dropped when it comes to domestic violence survivors coming forward, trafficking survivors coming forward. Initially, I would say right after the election, we did see somewhat of a drop in undocumented trafficking survivors coming forward. But since then, our numbers have ticked back up. And there's just been a real opportunity that the leadership has capitalized on to show that we are a pro-immigrant city. And we have seen that actually in many cities within the Rust Belt and the Great Lakes as well. So there are Detroit and Green Bay and Milwaukee and Lansing, to name a few, are what are called welcoming communities, where cities actually take on specific advocacy issues to say there's a certain percentage of funding that will go toward ensuring language access, for instance, and creating welcoming centers for new Buffalonians, new Green Bayans, I don't know what you call them, but cheeseheads, I guess. But really with the thought of how can we create, how can we welcome these immigrants? And so I know that when everything was happening with DACA, that John Kasich actually came forward and said, Ohio will take every person, every DACA recipient here. You are welcome here. Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse made a similar statement when the refugee number was lower, to say we will take every refugee here in upstate and western New York. So again, I don't want to at all sound too Pollyanna-ish about any of this, but I think that it really has the phrase that Suzanne talked about it depends where you live, used to be something we fought against in the trafficking services community, that it is the right of every crime victim to receive the same level of services wherever they wish to receive those services. We, of course, still believe that, but we also now see that there is an opportunity to talk with our providers across the country to say, Buffalo, for instance, or some of those other organizations in cities like that have welcoming communities, that this might be a place that if you can safely get here, that we will be able to provide the medical, the legal, the school-based, the housing, the economic support that you might not be getting elsewhere.
Gonzalo, speaking of geography, you're coming from quite a different perspective. Do you mind telling us a little bit about what you're seeing?
Yeah, the contrast could not be more severe between what Amy's describing, and I know it well from having spent many years in upstate New York with another agency that we'll be presenting this afternoon. But there really is a wide range of choices that local officials and state officials have to make about how they take a role in the current immigration environment. And Texas, where I happen to be managing an anti-trafficking program that focuses on labor trafficking in agriculture, has become a national laboratory for anti-immigrant policy. SB4 has been the big talk out of Texas, but there are many more sort of local level discretionary things that something like Westlaco PD that made a cameo appearance in the keynote this morning can do to either be a part of the solution or not. In the context of agricultural labor trafficking in Texas, the fate of a case can really vary depending on what part of that very big state you are. We have districts that are highly language accessible and culturally competent. We have areas where you would not want to end up in a situation where you need help from law enforcement as an immigrant, let alone an undocumented immigrant. Just to give you maybe one example of how trafficking has to cross that intersection of the anti-immigrant movement. One of our main partners for the project in Texas, by design, because of the work we do, because we do want to see some of these cases go through the criminal justice system when people want to seek recourse through that avenue, we have to partner, and we do partner with the Attorney General's office. Attorney General Paxton, you may have heard his name. If you follow immigration policy, you may have heard his name in the context of lawsuits against DACA. So as with one hand, they show up in that fight on one side of the equation, on the other, they have a human trafficking unit that will say, if you're a victim, we'd like to see you come forward. And I think the numbers that we saw this morning from Houston speak for themselves. The rates of undocumented victims of crime coming forward plummeted. And I think what's really interesting about that statistic is that that happened within 3 months of the administration coming into office, which we all know, especially with this administration, was not really enough time for them to appoint the cabinet and begin to really steer policy. A lot of DHS was still sort of on autopilot at that point. But it goes to show the power of the rhetoric and how these choices that politicians make do matter when it comes to giving people the trust to come forward when they need to.
Can you all, maybe we can go around the table and discuss some of the institutional changes, shifts in policy, shifts in focus that we're seeing at the federal level, and what you see sort of having the most impact in the things you're seeing every day at your work. Gonzalo, maybe this time we can start with you.
Do you actually want to go?
Or not.
I'll let Suzanne jump in and then.
There's definitely been shifts in policy, but as someone who provides direct services, there's still a lot of wait and see. So we spent August opening giant envelopes that cost the federal government to send back to us that they paid about $7 or $8 each. They basically mailed every application back to us that included a fee waiver for our clients applying for VAWA, U, or T immigration relief. Our clients live in homeless shelters, in domestic violence shelters, very low income individuals. They wouldn't be our clients if they weren't so low income. There was a shift in how they were adjudicating fee waiver applications because some of the add-on immigration applications have a fee, like an employment authorization cost just under $500. We do fill out the fee waiver form for our clients. USCIS decided that they want additional information attached. If they actually thumbed through the rest of the application, they could see that our clients live in shelters and are very low income. Instead, everything got mailed back. And I'm looking at Rachel, a staff attorney in my office, who's smiling because they got all dumped on her desk. If we knew that in advance, we would have prepared them differently. Now we're preparing things differently. There have been some policy memos that were issued by USCIS announcing changes in procedure regarding mailing in additional evidence or filing applications that are perceived to not quite be complete. In the past, we'd have many opportunities to supplement these applications. Now we're going to have less opportunities before applications are either just rejected or denied, which shifts how we're going to be filing things. And finally, the end of September, there was, over the last year and a half, there's been a lot of rumors and mumblings about change in accessing public benefits for immigrants and how that's going to affect applications. While the policy that was finally released the end of September is still a draft that will have a comment period, it's creating a lot of panic in immigrant communities that any access of public benefits will prevent people from legalizing their status in the future. Now, most of the families that we work with are mixed status families, so there's U.S. citizen children, some children who have DACA or green cards, and we've had clients calling us in a panic because many of the newspapers and radio stations are having stories on public charge, and we've had 2 clients call with particularly upsetting questions. One is from a client who is an HIV positive client who called asking if she should discontinue her benefits under HASA that she's entitled to that help her access her HIV medication and help maintain her health, and should she discontinue that in order to try to preserve her possibility of getting immigration benefits in the future. We had another family call us recently, too, with a severely disabled U.S. citizen child who's autistic, who receives services in their school. And the parents called asking if they should discontinue the services for their U.S. citizen child because they were concerned also about their pending immigration application. So it's, you know, in the mid-1990s, there was a drastic change in who could access immigration benefits. Most immigrants are not eligible for any immigration benefits at all, in general. In New York, we have expanded access to Medicaid, which does open up Medicaid to people who have pending applications and certain other, you know, less than U.S. citizen status access to Medicaid. So it's very confusing for people. People are very worried. It's unclear how the policy is exactly going to affect families. There is a statement about access by children to benefits for which they're entitled to, making the public charge change exempt to them, but it's just creating a huge panic on who could access what. We've been trying to reassure our clients that the policy is not final. I believe there will be litigation, and we just don't know how this is going to play out yet, but it's not helping people sleep any better at night.
So I have co-facilitated the Western District of New York Anti-Trafficking Task Force since 2007. And that's a task force that has considerable federal law enforcement participation. So it's run by the U.S. Attorney's Office, Homeland Security, FBI, federal DL, and then, DOL, and then a number of local law enforcement as well. Prior to the administration change, there were 9 HSI agents that were assigned to investigating and prosecuting human trafficking in the Western District of New York. And today there is 1 agent that is assigned to that investigation. So that's certainly shows a shift of priorities within Homeland Security. Just with sheer numbers. One of the things that, though I think is interesting, that hasn't changed is federal law enforcement's understanding of how the immigrant community sees them. And so as the co-facilitator of that task force, we really have developed relationships with specific agents over the years and investigators over the years where we would feel comfortable making referrals. There was a significant effort put into even doing outreach to some of the immigrant communities, talking about human trafficking specifically, and with HSI and FBI trying to talk about yes, we're not them, and we investigate these cases. And as service providers and our attorney partners as well, we actually supported that outreach efforts and made some of those linkages. And since the administration change, that is not true anymore, even though our relationships with some of the agents are still great. I mean, I go to their kids' birthday parties. I mean, we're very friendly, and I would never, ever make a referral to them directly now. But I think, amazed sometimes at their lack of understanding of how the administration change has changed our willingness to do that, or the immigrant population. And specifically, I was at a meeting very recently where an HSI supervisor was like, I mean, we're not trying to deport anyone. I don't understand what the problem is. Just really, right. So I think that also shows how insular some of their meetings and their work continues to be. The last thing I'll say, and this isn't, I don't think a policy, but certainly shows the impact, is that we've seen a real emboldenedness with federal law enforcement in how they treat nonprofits and NGOs and attorneys. So there really is some meetings that we've been in, and just an attitude that we haven't seen before about their ability to do whatever they want and not have to continue to be collaborative in the ways that they have been in more recent years.
I sort of selfishly punted to my co-panelists here on that question, because I knew that they're actually following the policy changes day to day and have more of the idea of the nuances. My perspective, managing a small outreach team, that's out on the farms. It's a little more downstream from what might hit an immigration attorney listserv, although I try to keep up with how things are developing there. There is a really long and sometimes meandering line of communication between those policy changes and what folks are perceiving sometimes on the ground. And there's definitely exceptions to that. There are incredible organizers and worker centers that try to digest news and get actionable information to impacted communities in Texas all over the map. But generally speaking, we have a population of 136,000 farm workers across the state of Texas. A lot of them work seasonally or migrate internally within the United States. It's just a lot of turnover. So it's always been a never-ending effort to keep folks updated on just the basics. What is a T visa? What are the recourses you have if this happens? What are your basic rights on the job? Adding the quickly developing policy changes on top of that is just another challenge and another layer. So one of the things I will say, I think I can say has been a change over the past few years working with that particular population is that even if if you consider enforcement practices a type of policy or policy direction, even if the numbers of deportees have not skyrocketed, the actual enforcement actions have become less predictable. Especially within agriculture, there's a set of tacit agreements or unspoken understandings between farmers, contractors, and law enforcement, depending on where you are in the country. And sometimes it's very strict to the point that a grower knows that the workers will not be the subject of an immigration raid until at least the harvest is over, which used to, still is a huge issue when people are deported at the end of a harvest, but at least there was that safety net. Now there's a sense that anything could happen anywhere at any time, and it's had all sorts of different effects on the calculus of growers, contractors, landlords who have to prepare the housing for the workers. Everyone is playing a guessing game about whether there will be a workforce, whether it's worth investing in this or investing in that, and that in itself has already had an effect even before the raids come.
So I think this is something that I've definitely seen in my reporting as well, this idea of like mixed messages and just a lot of confusion on the ground as to what the impacts of what the policies are going to be at first, but also what the impacts are going to be. Could you talk about sort of how, specifically how you are, seeing service providers, how are you communicating? What is the messaging that's coming out of these local service providers at the front lines who are communicating with immigrants and trying to explain all of these things? I know we've touched on that a little bit, but I'm hoping that you can expand a little bit. Maybe Amy, you can start.
Sure. So I would say that in our work in general, so I oversee both a immigrant-specific domestic violence program and then also a human trafficking program where we serve all survivors of trafficking. So in domestic violence specifically, I would say that 70% of our time spent with survivors is on education and knowing your rights. So immigrant survivors, at least where we are much less likely, just in general, to access the criminal justice system and even the family court system. And we've done a lot of work over the last 10 years to try to figure out, what is that impediment? And so what we're working against, of course, is trying to understand what are the lies that the abuser is telling the survivor in order to keep her isolated and within the abusive relationship. And so a story that I often tell, but is, I think, very indicative of this, is a Nepalese woman who we were working with maybe 3 years ago, and she had engaged in services as a domestic violence survivor, engaged in services, and she had status. She was a refugee woman, and she would be actively engaged in services for several months at a time, and then she would disengage, and we wouldn't hear from her, and then she would come back, and she would re-engage, and then we wouldn't hear from her. So after about 2 years, we brought up this pattern with her and just said, we get really close and you seem really eager, and then something happens can you tell me more about that? And very matter-of-factly, she said, that I come back after a significant violent incident and we're working together, but as soon as you bring up child protection, I know I have to run away because everyone knows that CPS injects children with a serum that makes them forget their mothers. And she said that in such a matter-of-fact way that it was clear that this was being used within certainly her own household, but our guess was within the Nepalese community and refugee community in Buffalo to keep women from coming forward to talk about what was happening to them. Now, I can't ever ask on an intake, tell me all of the lies your abuser is telling you so that we can counter them, right? So the only way to do that is by building a relationship so that they always come back and we welcome them back when they want to, and to try to talk about their rights in the United States as women, as wives, as victims, as mothers, all of that. So I guess I tell that story because what I think has changed significantly since the administration change is that now abusers don't have to just make things up. They can point to a story that happened in Texas, or they can, we have never had, ICE does not show up at our courthouses. We don't have that. And we have a DA's office and we have judges and we have local police who have said that will not happen here in Buffalo. I don't mean it couldn't, but we've been trying to be proactive with that. But the isolated woman on the west side of Buffalo doesn't know that, right? She knows when her abuser brings her the story in the newspaper about someone in Texas who was arrested while they were filing an order of protection. So I think that that's one of the things that we're really fighting hard against, is that the abusers don't have to make anything up anymore. But I think one of the strategies, and I don't want to go too much off on a tangent, but one of the strategies that we have really tried to implement in Buffalo is a more local response. So when the administration change happened, we immediately went to our newly elected DA, and we went to our newly elected sheriff, and we went to the mayor and the county executive, and we said, this is what we're up against. What is your stance on this? And will you be public about this? So City Hall had a Welcome Refugees flag that went up. Like, we tried to really capitalize on both, I think, the goodwill towards immigrants because Buffalo is liberal, but also Buffalo is very religious. And that's the other, I think, where I don't understand how this isn't happening more nationally, that we've really tried to capitalize on how many Catholics and Christians are in Buffalo to say it is not Christian, these policies. Even from a political standpoint, it's really been, I mean, we're a non-religious affiliated organization, but so we've also, I guess, experienced the opposite, where we have more volunteers than we've ever had before. We've had people that we have not accepted, but who want to start an underground railroad right? I mean, there's just been like a lot of goodwill in that way that we've tried to capitalize on, both frankly for fundraising and for bringing forward tips, and also politically.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting silver lining to all this. You know, the first 9 months after the administration came in, I actually was not working in trafficking for a change for a minute before I headed off to Texas, and I spent some time in the policy shop of an anti-Trump grassroots group called Indivisible in DC, sort of getting resources to people who wanted to learn more and see what they could do. And I was sort of floored by how many people were discovering ongoing practices that had been standard for sometimes multiple administrations, and now they found it really egregious because it was coming out of this one. So I wasn't going to be the one to sort of, give the history lesson, or, but it really has in many ways, especially at the peak of the family separation crisis, the resources poured in. I had a meeting with Sister Norma Pintel over at the Humanitarian Respite Center in McAllen that was previously scheduled before all that happened. And it happened that we just were supposed to meet the morning of that Melania had flown into town with the jacket and all of that, But when the national news had really staged, they were set up 24 hours a day at that point asking what was happening to the kids. I could not get through the main room of that office. You know, I had to like push the site Telemundo live, and there's people trying to, flying in from all over the country, seeing what they could do. So in that sense, groups like Raíces, Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, sort of the frontline service providers are seeing more resources come in, but the need is also rising. So and the cases are getting more challenging in ways that are really difficult to address with resources, right? If you have a victim of labor trafficking that has taken that extraordinary step of taking the leap of faith of cooperating with law enforcement, working with a legal aid to try to find some type of remedy, and then they get caught up in deportation proceedings, that's a really difficult case to unravel, even if you have the best resourced legal team in the country. So that's sort of the blessing and the curse of the moment that we're in.
Could you kindly repeat the question?
Yeah. I was just wondering what how service providers, what are the challenges and opportunities service providers who are on the front lines are facing in the current scenario? So, yeah, how are they sort of framing these issues? What are the things that they're taking advantage of? More resources, perhaps. And then, what are the constraints that they're feeling? I think someone mentioned to me earlier burnout. That's one of the issues that I feel like anyone who's working with such serious issues on a day-to-day basis on the front lines can face. So in terms of staffing, funding, what are some things you're seeing?
I feel like we could have a whole panel just on this topic. Some of the challenges, our staff is smaller than it was a few years ago. We work with pro bono attorneys, generally from large law firms. And while the excitement and the interest is there, particularly on topics that are in the news, the cases of, the cases that are going on the border aren't necessarily what we have here in New York City. And I found that there's less of an appetite to take on full-blown representation because these cases take 7 years, 10 years, maybe longer. I don't know when it will be finished. I don't know when the backlog will catch up to when you file this application. So it's more challenging to place actual individual representation. Mm-hmm. And even on our asylum docket, we just don't know when people are going to get interviews. The court all of a sudden will schedule people 6 weeks out after applying for asylum. But if you applied last October, you're not going to have an interview for 3 years. Mm-hmm. It's just all over the place, and it's very difficult to manage workflow. And as a mentor to an attorney who doesn't have a background in immigration, I feel like it makes me sound less than confident in the advice that I'm giving. And it's really just we have to be responsive to whatever the federal government is throwing at us to adequately represent our clients. It's also difficult to reassure clients when policies change. How do we update our clients? Mm-hmm. Years go by, children want to get married. That often bumps them out of eligibility as a derivative on their parents' applications. There's a lot of changes on the horizon, and for people who have been practicing immigration law for a long time or working with immigrants in various communities, there is somewhat of a feeling of helplessness or hopelessness for some of the advocates, mm-hmm. which I hope that we could continue to channel into wanting to fight back harder, fight back more, and fight back longer. Mm-hmm. But I see a lot of new attorneys who only practice for a few years and then decide the stakes are too high, and it takes a personal toll on them. Mm-hmm. And we really don't know what we're fighting against anymore. We could have another couple of years of this administration or another 6 years. I mean, it's just really hard to predict, and to feel like a victim advocate is fighting against some insurmountable challenge and a change in policies that make us feel like we're going back 20 or 30 years is very frustrating. Mm-hmm. But I do hope that it does channel and mobilize more individuals to give to the organizations that are helping crime victims in general, immigrants, trafficking survivors, and for people who want to volunteer. Sometimes there's a little pushback, like, what do you mean I want to volunteer? I want to give my time, find something for me to do. Be open, be flexible. If you have a language skill or a professional degree, there might be certain opportunities available to you. If you're looking to volunteer in a different way, reach out to a local service organization and find out what the organization really would benefit from, what the population that they're working with would really benefit from. Raíces is a fantastic organization. There was a lot of online campaigns to donate. And then what did they raise, like $12 million or something pretty insane? And then it's like, all of a sudden, what do we do with all this money? I know they're doing really great programming, but think, locally how you could support your local organizations with time or funds as well.
One thing I wanted to ask is related to something, we've heard in Sarah's keynote, but that I think as practitioners we are sort of hearing everywhere, which is this idea of all of these spillover effects, right? How these policy changes and the fear that they cause and the confusion that they cause these effects that are much, that affect entire communities. So Gonzalo, and entire systems, right? So could you talk a little bit about that and what you're seeing in Texas?
Sure. Yeah. So I alluded to, for example, the landlords as part of the equation for the labor context in agriculture. Part of the way we approach ag outreach is before the crews begin to come in, we take a little time to get out to the more far-flung parts of the state and do a little mapping of where the sites are going to be, just to get an idea of which will be open, which are not going to host migrants, and then we can make the most of our time when we finally get out to the field. So we were out in the panhandle of Texas with focusing on cotton and getting ready for that in the midsummer, and also looking at watermelon and the vineyards. And at one of these sites that is known among outreach workers in that area to be a major host of dozens of workers every season, I was having a conversation with the landlord, which sometimes can be the only person left off season. It's kind of taking care of the grounds and getting ready. And just based on what he'd been hearing secondhand through other folks that sort of serve that community, based on the climate, based on what the growers were saying, they also happen to be facing a drought, so that's always that factor of unpredictability in agriculture. They decided not to prepare the housing that season, and it's not because the workers necessarily called, and it's hard to really know which workers will show up at which farm when, but he walked away with a general sense, kind of scanning his environment, that it was not worth investing in the housing for the workers because there was a high enough risk that they might not show up. And it is true to a degree, folks have tried to migrate less because it is a risk to be on the road. If they found a good job for at least part of the year, they try to stay in the community that they are and not move around as much. So it might have been a very well-informed decision, but nonetheless, what that means is that when push comes to shove, when that grower needs the labor, they will find a way to get it. And if that means really going to an unscrupulous labor contractor that's willing to promise people something so they can at least get them there, then they'll work with that person. And what really struck me thinking through that situation is that if and when those workers arrive, and it's probably when, because the climate is looking good for this season, they will have that many less options for housing. Which just puts them, if you think of this as just sort of a never-ending a bargain between different stakeholders, suddenly the farm workers have that much less leverage because they have that many fewer housing options. As I've learned from worker justice student of New York here, the contractors shoving people into very small spaces in the back of a farm because there's no other options of where to stay can be the start of a much worse situation where it leads to other forms of exploitation. So that's one example of where this broader context of anti-immigrant rhetoric, where the broader context of folks fearing migration has already had an effect even before the workers had a chance to arrive.
Amy, do you have anything to add to that in terms of sort of the incentives that you're seeing and sort of the effects of on people who sort of are trafficking, run trafficking rings, or domestic abusers, things like that. Sort of big picture effects or effects on entire communities that you're seeing out there.
No, I mean, I think I'll just go back to talking about the fear. I think that there is, we ourselves don't know what the message is day to day. And so I think, and that leads, I'm just going to pivot back, I guess, a little bit to your comment before around burnout. It certainly is something our staff has not decreased in crime victim work, but certainly many trafficking programs that are not in large cities are in refugee resettlement organizations. And so, again, a silver lining I'll talk about is that New York State is the only state in the country that we know of that has put specific money in its budget to support refugee integration with refugee resettlement organizations, many of whom, like mine, that are in danger of closing because of the number of refugees has gone from 130,000 in President Obama's last year to the rumor is about 30,000. And it used to be, again, in prior administrations, that ceiling number would be what the administration shot for, that we wanted that many. Now it's simply a ceiling. So there are a lot of refugee resettlement organizations across the country that are in danger of closing, not knowing what they're going to do. And so I think that they're, amongst practitioners, there's also this feeling of our energy should be focused on fighting the traffickers. And instead, we are fighting the federal government who funds us. And so it's a really odd place to be in. The majority of our funding in my program comes from the federal government. And so you're here, there's just a lot more strategies that need to be implemented, I guess. And even being on this panel, I mean, coming to this day was a conversation that I had with my executive director about what that could look like, by whom and how how will we handle that if we need to. So I just think that that conversation is not time well spent within our organization. What our time and energy should be focused on is in fighting the traffickers and supporting survivors. And that has really, I think, shifted. And again, that being said, I do think that it is always important to, I'm sounding such like a social worker now, but really take care of each other. And I think that there has been a lot more outreach, and that strategizing is not a bad thing when you're looking for new collaborations. And we have been successful, I think, in finding some of those that we didn't have the need to reach out to before.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that Suzanne, do you want to add anything?
Just briefly, and I'm kind of throwing it back to Gonzalo. You mentioned housing, but I'm also thinking about seasonal workers. If you limit lawful temporary work visas in an effort to clamp down on migration or illegal migration. I just have trouble understanding sort of what the big picture view of the federal government is, because I think a lot of the policies are actually will affect the economy in a negative way, but thinking crops rotting on the vine, seasonal workers that are needed in hotel or resort areas, all this sort of reconceptualizing how immigration is supposed to work is going to affect those industries as well. Whether or not that affects trafficking ebbs and flows we really don't know. But I certainly have many clients who did come lawfully to work as seasonal workers in the hotel industry who ended up being trafficked. So limiting those visas, I'm not sure would limit labor trafficking, because it's just going to sort of encourage perhaps other forms of labor, like you said, going to less than scrupulous labor recruiters. But
Do you want to respond?
Yeah, And there's another topic we could spend the whole afternoon kind of diving into with the guest worker visas, but I'll just share one image, down actually off the fields. We do cover all other forms of low-wage workplaces involving food with this program. So one of the workforces we look at are the shrimpers. And they had their kickoff to the season down at the, or their peak season in Brownsville at the bottom of the sort of the curve of the Gulf Coast in the United States. Half of those boats are sitting on the dock. It's not for lack of wanting to get out and get the shrimp. It's because the H-2B visas have not been coming through at the rate they used to. So it's very interesting to see in districts that have probably supported this administration in high numbers to see them come back around and say, well, everything but, right? So if you're interested in that rabbit hole, and we won't get into it today, but look at the proposals coming from Representative Bob Goodlatte in Virginia of actually in the context of anti-legal immigration policies, they're looking to expand the H-2A visa and make it cover more sectors than it used to, make it year-round, where now it's restricted to seasonal workers. And as you mentioned, it's absolutely not the silver bullet when it comes to protecting the workers. There's been cases within the guest worker visa program. There's been cases outside of it. But that's the shifting landscape for sure.
I do want to spend some time talking about solutions. And I think one theme that I'm seeing throughout is, and this is something that I definitely is what I cover, is a lot of really, really interesting work happening at the local level as it relates to criminal justice reform, really like looking at the pipeline as a whole. I've covered some things about how cities are changing some of the policies around how they criminalize youth who have experienced trauma, who run away from home, and things like that. How things like trafficking, loitering, these small petty offenses can land someone up in a deportation pipeline. And I'm wondering sort of what all of you are seeing. What are some effective solutions that you've seen play out at a local level? That are sort of opportunities that other cities and organizations can also sort of leverage.
Solutions, I feel like, is a broad, overly optimistic term right now. I think one step in the right direction, at least on trafficking, that I think should be duplicated in other areas are the multidisciplinary task forces that have taken place all over the United States on trafficking in particular over the last 15 or so years. Here in New York, we have one in Brooklyn, which is really the only anti-trafficking task force in the city that has members of both social service organizations, federal, state, and local law enforcement. And it really does open up an opportunity for dialogue and networking among the service providers and law enforcement, where there really is no other opportunity to interact in the same way. I will say personally, myself, I don't think the criminal justice system is the absolute answer to solving human trafficking. I think that there's some argument, particularly with the human trafficking courts, that it is an opportunity at times for individuals to encounter services as a result of encountering law enforcement, but I don't believe that should be the only way, or that's an absolute way to solve trafficking. Our labor trafficking clients almost never encounter law enforcement. They often come to service providers other ways, either seeking help for domestic violence or some other issue in their lives that they've sought other assistance with. And a social worker or a teacher or a neighbor or community member has recognized that they may need some legal services or additional help, and that has directed them to speaking with an attorney or social worker who could guide them throughout some assistance. But I think solutions are difficult. I think transparent policies at the hand of the government and on labor rights and what you're entitled to in the workplace, how to be safe in the workplace, open conversations about what a safe workplace looks like, and for those who choose to migrate, what safe migration looks like, and that there's help and resources available. But I don't think that there's, one magic solution to ending trafficking. It's a combination of factors.
I guess I would say that our number one strategy is always relationship building, that it's helpful, obviously, to have protocols and new case law and regulations and new legislation for that accountability piece, and yet the manner in which law enforcement or even social service providers follow those regulations really depends on their understanding of an issue that often seems like the craziest thing they've ever heard. So when vacatur is a perfect example that we, and by we I mean not exactly me, worked so hard within the movement to have vacating laws put on the books in most states. And then I was in a meeting talking to somebody from a hypothetical attorney general's office, and who had just literally could not understand why we would help criminals, and said that out loud after years of working on this. And so I think what we try to do at the Institute is make sure that we are going to coffee, riding to see clients in the same car, any opportunity to carpool. I know these seem like such small things, and I remember when I started this work asking a much more experienced person, like, how have you made a difference? And she said, you have to have drinks with law enforcement. And I was so angry. I thought that was the dumbest piece of advice, and now that's all I tell anybody else. But that really, that's when the conversations about the impact of trauma happens. That's when the conversations of the results of a criminal history on their current, on our client's current decision-making process happens. And that's really where we've seen real impact. And so I think, and I guess the bigger picture, and I'll kind of have a little shout out to mid-sized communities like Buffalo, is that we can have a larger impact and create some of that case law. So we are about to have and I should knock on wood when I say this, but we are about to have a trafficking survivors 2 felonies vacated. One is a drug felony, one is a gun charge, who's a trafficking survivor who is currently being prosecuted federally as a co-conspirator, and our local DA's office is about to vacate 2 state federal charges. And it wasn't hard because we have those relationships. And so I know that can be really helpful at other parts throughout the state, but nobody reached out to us at some point, to do that. We kind of inched our way along. So I guess that's the other piece, is that to look more broadly to see where an impact might be able to be made, even legislatively. I mean, our legislators in smaller communities are people that we know well and who will answer the phone when we call. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
One of the things we did when we got to Texas, because it is a pilot initiative and we're testing different sorts of grants to address labor trafficking, is we took the time to get an outside evaluator to sort of do an impact evaluation framework from beginning to end. We got the data, like they said this morning. We did a baseline assessment with Dr. Vanessa Boucher at TCU, who had previously, I think, worked a bit in the space of trafficking already. And part of what she found, and I'm really glad that my organization thought to put in this element, because really the data can bring out really interesting insights. And one of the things we learned right off the bat when we got to town is that when we gave prosecutors, local prosecutors, DAs and ADAs, and local law enforcement, sheriff's offices, PDs, a list of just a battery of true or false questions about human trafficking, they were scoring about 50-ish%, not much better than a coin flip on the true or false questions. And then one of the ones that really stood out for me is 84% of respondents to that survey thought that smuggling and trafficking were synonymous, that they meant the same thing, which just makes me wonder, what people think an anti-trafficking program might be. Half the room might think you're looking to secure the border, right? So it's a real sobering sort of number for us in Texas, but it's also a realization that there's room for training, there's room for education. An agency, no matter how well-meaning they are, if they are not equipped with the baseline understanding of what we are even talking about addressing, they are not going to be able to move forward in a coordinated way to do it. So to the end of getting there, we have spent a lot of time training, but we also are investing in increasing the resources of local stakeholders where there really is so much discretion, right? So in one of the counties down in the valley that happens to have we think they're a little ahead of the curve in terms of understanding all forms of trafficking and prosecuting labor trafficking cases as labor trafficking and not one of the many other ways that they can go. We are writing a grant to provide them a full-time prosecutor that will only focus on labor trafficking and a full-time investigator within that DA's office that will only focus on labor trafficking. It's been done before. Alameda County in California has something like that, but it's not been tried in Texas as far as we know. So I think we are trying to see if we play with the variable of resources at the local level, how far can they run with it? You'll have to ask me again in 2 years.
I think with that, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience because I want to make sure that we get those in for our panelists. I think there's going to be a mic going around. Does anyone
the
have
brave soul.
questions? Yeah.
So I was wondering if anybody on the panel has been seeing the effect of recent policy changes or practices on whether folks who have pending T&Us are at risk of deportation while it's pending. And relatedly, what impacts, we talked about vacatur, there's no federal vacatur law, unfortunately. What impact federal convictions is having on T&U applications?
Any criminal conviction or arrest for that matter, even before a conviction, would have an effect on an immigration application. That hasn't changed at all. As far as, meaning you have to disclose it to USCIS, depending on what the ultimate outcome is, would have to be reported when someone has a pending application. And depending on the level of the criminal conviction, that all really hasn't changed that I've been able to see with my clients. However, if someone is arrested, it could mean that they're put into custody. If that database is shared or that information is shared with immigration, that could rapidly change how someone's pending immigration application could progress. Or if they don't yet have something pending, it changes the landscape quite a bit. In New York City, there's defender organizations that are funded to provide immigration counsel to people in proceedings. As far as pending applications, there's still a lot to be seen. If there's immigration encounters while someone has an application pending, for cases that are now being denied, the new policy went into effect, I believe, in mid-September. I want to say September 14th. So I know we had a denial last week, which I know from the email system, but I don't know the basis of it. So I haven't seen the paperwork. I can't respond to it. It's really hard to say yet because we haven't seen things play out. In the past, I could confidently tell people that if you're applying to one of the humanitarian programs, VAWA, U, or T, we were always told by the Vermont Service Center staff that those application denials would be put on a shelf unless there was a serious felony that would make someone removable. All of those bets are pretty much off now. I still think and hope, at least, that there will be lower priority on these case types, but we just really haven't seen yet how that's all going to play out. It makes it much more challenging. I know we have some cases that I think I would have been more amped up to file because they have somewhat creative legal arguments, particularly on labor trafficking or fraud in foreign labor contracting, that I think I'm a bit more cautious about filing now, particularly for individuals who never had any immigration contact before. It's one thing if you're doing things defensively for someone who's already in immigration proceedings in front of the judge. You want to strategize and come up with every single remedy possible and sort of go forth with anything that has merit. However, if no one has, they enter the U.S. without inspection, they've never had any immigration contact, I'm much more cautious about bringing someone forth to immigration unless they have a much more straightforward claim.
So I'm not an attorney, but just what we've seen. So our office is 11 miles from the Canadian border. And for reasons passing all understanding, it is not clearly marked, the last exit that you need to take before you get to the border. And so it's like a big joke in Buffalo that like everybody just like all of a sudden is at the border because the signage is so bad for everyone. And so we recently had and so it's part of our safety planning, literally with survivors to talk about what the exit looks like and how to be careful. We recently had a survivor just turned 18 years old. She has continued presence and is awaiting her T visa approval, we hope. And she didn't get off the exit and got to the border, and she was NTA'd. So Border Patrol called HSI. HSI gave a notice to appear in immigration court as an NTA. We would never have seen that before, ever. Luckily, she reached out to her immigration attorney who, took it up the chain really quickly, and it was let go of immediately. But I just thought it was just a really interesting attitude shift that we hadn't seen before. And I was in Arizona. We were in Arizona a couple of weeks ago, and I wasn't in Arizona with the same group of people before the administration changed, so I'll say that. But I was really astonished at this group of 40 to 50 law enforcement that we were training on labor trafficking who just most of whom had a general attitude that most trafficking survivors were making it up so that they could get status, and comments of like, well, I don't have to sign anything, so why would I? Just really, I wonder if before the administration changed, they would have thought that, but not said it out loud within that room.
We have time.
Other questions?
Time for one, maybe two more questions.
Hi, I'm Laura Rizzo. I'm a victim specialist with the FBI. So I'm not an agent. I work in partnership with agents to coordinate services for crime victims in our cases. So there's only about 150 of us throughout the country, and we're in a very unique position. I'd say the best job in the Bureau because we get to solely work with crime victims. And I'll just say this, like in New York City right now, I just want to make 2 points real quick. We have a task force up, Human Trafficking Task Force, which started last fall. So we actually have more people working trafficking in New York City. So if you have a referral, you can bring it to the FBI. I can't speak for HSI because I'm not HSI. But we are very victim-centered in our investigations. And I or one of my 2 other victim specialist partners are there for most of the interviews. So we make sure that victims are aware of their rights as federal crime victims. The second thing I just want to say is that we have a lot of agent turnover in the FBI in terms of working human trafficking violations and CSEC matters, which kind of fall in the same thing. We are constantly training agents on these topics. And CSEC is commercial sexual exploitation of children. So it's underage kids who may be forced into having sex with strangers for money, and it's trafficking, but in minors. So yeah, we spend a lot of our time also training agents and partners on, what is trafficking? What are the myths around it? You mentioned the smuggling, sir, the smuggling and trafficking being the same. That's a common myth everywhere. It drives me nuts too, because there are such unique issues that surround this victim population. And so I'm just saying, at least from my office, the largest field office in the FBI, the three of us, the victim specialists, we spend a lot of time training agents on this very topic and victim issues. And we are 24/7, and we will go on operations to make sure that victims are treated fairly. So I just had to say that, and thank you for, this was very useful information you guys gave today, so thank you.
Can I just make a comment? Because I'm not from New York City. So I think that it's really important that law enforcement who, or anyone who uses the words client-centered, that we sit down and talk about what that means in practice, right? I don't know you, so I can't say that but just from a service provider's perspective, we hear that all the time, and our clients get deported. So I think that what's helpful in our office and what we try to do is to sit down, again, drinks or coffee or both, to really walk through. So tell me what that means to you, because in the end, I have to pitch this to my client. I can't do anything without their permission. And I think that I work with some amazing agents, and I know what that means, and I trust them, and I can say to clients, you can trust this person. And there are some agents who say the exact same thing who don't act that out and what that looks like. So I think that, again, back to relationship building, there's a lot of words that are kind of thrown around the field, and having making the effort to sit down and really walk through what that will look like if and when we make a referral to law enforcement is really, really helpful.
Thank you. I think that's it, so let's give a round of applause. Thank you, Tanvi, Gonzalo, Amy, and Suzanne.